Hello there. You might notice I'm sitting down because I'm utterly exhausted as I'm moving to Spain, and I want to talk about that in another video. It would take a bit too much time here. And so today we are making a reader favorite that hasn't yet gotten a video that it really deserves, which is my easy high protein sourdough bread. Now, when I say high protein, I mean it's double from your normal sourdough loaf. So it has, instead of about 3.5 grams, it has 7 grams of protein. How do we get there? Adding whey protein powder and cottage cheese to it is the trick. Now, for those of you interested in the science behind this, here is what I discovered in my sourdough journey, sourdough protein journey to be exact, when I was looking into it. I wasn't the first one, however, barely anybody is talking about it, and I don't know why that is. It baffles me a bit, because there is a study out there, several actually, with scientists who found that if you feed sourdough bread enriched with whey protein to rats compared to a test group that got commercially yeasted bread, no sourdough, also with added whey protein, the group that got the sourdough with protein had a higher protein content in the body afterwards than the test group. That is fabulous news. Now, how is that? So the protein, the sourdough contains lactic acid bacteria. Lactic acid bacteria is the same thing you find in yogurt. So essentially, they don't make a big difference between added protein and the protein in the flour. They just digest it all thanks to an enzyme called proteases. They break down the protein into easier digestible molecules, and so your body can use it better. Fabulous news, right? Now we need to carefully dose the protein so we don't come out with bread brick, because if you add too much, it gets really dry. And so I tend to balance it by adding protein in another form, in this case cottage cheese, that has also high protein, but it balances, due to the acidity, the protein powder potential dryness, because it breaks it down too and attracts moisture and so on, and the sourdough does that too. So these three work together in marvelous ways to give you a really balanced, lovely artisan sourdough loaf with more protein that you can easier digest. So today I'm going to show you how to make the basic dough, because that is what you need for the next few weeks for a few more recipes you can make with this. And as I said, I have moving brain, so I wanted something very easy. So next week we'll make Salzstange, which is an Austrian bake, kind of a stick, salted caraway sticks, as we call them in Hanover, where I live, or lived, grew up. And they are lovely, very easy to shape, exactly the same dough. Then we go over inclusions with a lovely dill pickle cheddar bread that I'm absolutely in love with, and a sourdough croissant bread that I admit I kind of borrowed from Amy Bakes, who made it go viral, and modified it with my protein version. So you get croissant and feel good protein added, because very buttery and lovely and delicious and flaky, but you also then get the feel good protein. Sounds good? Let's make it. You want to start making your sourdough starter 2 days before you want to bake your bread. And I do it usually these days with a ratio from 1 to 12 to 9. So you have a very firm mix, which means it raises slower and is usable much longer, and it gets a much higher and longer activity peak. And then you start with your bread ingredients. And usually I blend my cottage cheese with protein powder, so I have a really smooth mix when I add a bit of water in. blend that just quickly until smooth, and then stir in your sourdough starter that should be relatively active by now, just until smooth, and salt goes into the flour, all the liquid into the flour mix, and then use your other spoon, or as I do here, a Danish dough whisk, to get a shaggy dough. You don't need a stand mixer for this, you just need, and if your dough is a little dry as mine is here, you just squish in a bit of water. So you want your dough relatively wet and sticky, so that is the difference between sourdough and yeasted dough. If you never made sourdough before, you'll be probably surprised how wet this is. Now leave that for half an hour, and I like to clean the sides of my bowl with this silicone spatula that I got from a KitchenAid site, and just so I have an easier time to wash up later, I just have it neat. And then after half an hour you do your first set of stretch and fold with wet hands, so it doesn't stick to your hands as much. You pull it up, fold it over, turn your bowl by 90 degrees and do the same thing again. Repeat this 3 times roughly, then cover it, leave it for half an hour and do the same thing again. And after doing this 3 times, your dough will look like this. Very smooth, very nice, a lot of gluten development, elasticity, and then you can leave it for bulk fermenting. And you see the first bubbles appearing here, so your dough is nice and active. I like to shape it in a bit of a ball form before I leave it for bulk fermenting. You don't need to necessarily do it, I just think it looks pretty neat. So I cover it with a lid or with cling film and then leave it for about 6 hours until I see it visibly risen, very jiggly and bubbly. And then I personally like to shape it, and for that I wet my banneton lightly with a bit of a sprinkle of water and then add rice flour to it, because the rice flour doesn't get absorbed by the bread compared to if you would use wheat flour for this. Now take your dough, put it on a floured work surface and stretch it out into a rectangle, and be very gentle with it. So if you use very gentle movements, it won't stick to your hands and you won't rip it. So you want to keep all the bubbles in. Now fold 1/3 of the rectangle over and then the top third over the bottom third, like a letter fold. Rotate by 90 degrees, then stretch it out a little bit and start rolling it up from the short side, so top or bottom, doesn't matter, just very tightly into a neat little loaf until it's all rolled up. And then you turn it up so you see the seam and you kind of knit it close with kind of pinching motion. And the sides, you tuck them in. See the side here, you just tuck it in and pinch it close too, so you have a neat and tidy loaf. Once you're happy with the shape, flip it over, seam side down, flour it a little, and then start pushing with the side of your palms underneath the loaf to get a nice bit of tension into the shape you like, oval or round, doesn't matter. And then you put it into your banneton with the top side down, so you get these nice ridges. And I like to put it into a bag for the overnight fermentation in the fridge, and for the rice so it stays nice and moist, it doesn't dry out. I close it, and then the next morning when it's nicely risen and jiggly, as you can see here, while your oven is preheating, you just flip it onto a piece of baking parchment, give it a score. It doesn't have to be pretty, mine never is. I'm just useless with scoring, to be honest. And the next day you have a perfect sourdough protein loaf. This is perfect with anything you eat your bread with. I love it with a bit of cheese or jam, but it's also perfect for a salad on the side or dipped into a hot bowl of soup. Now this is the base dough I use for lots of different things, and I show you how in the next few weeks.